Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're just about ready to start. I'm Marianne Larzalier, my husband John, and we are the very fortunate people who had John for parents and me for in-laws, and what a wonderful thing. We're so pleased and proud to bring you the 8th Henry and Annabelle Larzalier Memorial Lecture, the 8th one. I was thinking about when we first started, I think we had about 30 people in the Robertson room. It was about science and faith. That was our first one. So since then, we've come quite a long ways, had wonderful lectures, and we're so pleased to be with you today and appreciate your being here. First of all, I'd like to thank our planning committee. Sandy, are you here? Sandy and Carol Bryson? They're here. And Penny and Mike Swart, who helped us plan this, and especially to Pastor Lisa Schrott from the Presbyterian Church of Okemos, who when I said to her, who do you think would be a good person to come and talk about racism, said, oh, I have the perfect person for you. He was my professor at Columbia Seminary. So that is how we got William Yu here. And I'm so happy to have him here with us today, and I know you're going to appreciate everything he talks about. So I'm going to hand the mic over now to Shawnthea, who will welcome him.
I'm Shawnthea Monroe. I'm the senior pastor here at the People's Church, and on behalf of all the members and staff of the People's Church, I'm delighted to welcome you here to this 8th annual Henry and Annabelle Larzalier Memorial Lecture. We are so delighted to have Reverend Dr. William Yu as our speaker today, and those of us who are members of the church are particularly excited because we already enjoyed a quite wonderful and inspiring sermon this morning, and we're looking for the rest of that conversation to be carried forward. Reverend Dr. William Yu is the Assistant Professor of American Religious and Cultural History at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, as I said this morning. That's in Atlanta, for those of you who don't know your maps. Dr. Yu's latest book covers a history and legacy of slavery and anti-Black racism in American Presbyterianism. His current research interests include tracing the histories of racial injustice, settler colonialism, and slavery in the United States, and examining indigenous, Black, and Asian American theologies of freedom and resistance. He is also a minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA, who has a passion for writing, teaching, and preaching honest narratives of the past, integrating Reformed understandings of confession and illumination. His conviction is that deeper engagement with history will aid us in more faithful and effective participation in our present ministries, expressing God's love, justice, grace, and righteousness in all we say and do. We are so delighted to have Reverend Dr. William Yu to join us. And remember, you're going to want to be able to see the screen, so sit someplace where that's visible. And at the end of the lecture, there will be a time of Q&A, and we will come around with our microphone. So welcome to Dr. William Yu.
Hey, thanks so much for being here. It is, again, an honor to be at the People's Church, to be here in East Lansing. Grateful to Marianne and John, and also the lectureship committee. And thank you to Dr. Monroe for the welcome to People's Church. So I'm just going to get going, and we're going to move forward here. So in the fall of 1831, a free Black woman entered the office of the Liberator newspaper in Boston. Maria W. Stewart did not have an appointment, and the newspaper's two white editors, William Lloyd Garrison and Isaac Knapp, were surprised to see her. But the editors welcomed Stewart into their modest headquarters, befitting a startup that launched its first issue on January 1st, 1831. One colleague remembered the office where Garrison and Knapp began their abolitionist newspaper. Quote, "The dingy walls, the small windows besmattered with printer's ink, the press standing in one corner, the composing stands opposite. the long editorial and mailing table covered with newspapers, the bed of the editor and publisher on the floor, end quote. Garrison introduced the Liberator in the first issue as a periodical devoted to the cause of Black liberation and the immediate abolition of slavery. Garrison described the resistance that he encountered from white Americans in the northern states during his recent lecture tour as, quote, contempt more bitter, opposition more active, detraction more relentless, prejudice more stubborn, and apathy more frozen than among slave owners themselves, end quote. But Garrison informed the readers of the Liberator that its pages would report the whole truth about the oppression of slavery and how these injustices betrayed American democracy and Christianity. As its editor, Garrison promised to be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. And he warned, quote, let Southern oppressors tremble, let their secret abettors tremble, let their Northern apologists tremble, let all the enemies of the persecuted blacks tremble. The man knew how to write. Stewart was one of the fledgling newspaper's readers, but she was also a writer and held in her hands a manuscript to submit to Garrison and Knapp. The three individuals shared the same convictions and were close in age, as each was in their mid-20s. Stewart was born in 1803, Knapp in 1804, and Garrison in 1805. But Stewart stood apart because of her race and gender. Black women like Stewart had important and powerful messages to convey, but they inhabited a world dominated by black men. Many people did not believe that either black men or white women belonged in the domains of public speaking and writing. The notion of publishing an essay from a black woman, therefore, probably seemed outrageous. But as Garrison and Knapp read Stewart's work, they determined that it was worthy of a wider audience. Stewart's writings were first included in issues of The Liberator and then published as separate pamphlets. The 2 years preceding Stewart's visit to Garrison and Knapp were difficult and traumatic for her. An orphan at 5 years of age, Stewart was indentured to a white pastor in Hartford from roughly 1808 to 1818. After her indenture, Stewart labored in domestic work for several more years in Connecticut until she had saved enough money to relocate to Boston. In 1826, she married James W. Stewart, a black naval veteran who performed military service in the War of 1812 and then worked as a shipping agent at the port of Boston. James died suddenly of heart failure in 1829, and several of his white business associates exploited his unexpected death to subsequently cheat Maria from receiving her rightful claim to the estate. As Maria Stewart grieved the loss of her husband, she began to write. She also practiced a vigorous devotional life, with many hours spent in prayer and Bible reading. Shortly after Stewart approached Garrison and Knapp, the editors published her essay entitled, quote, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the Sure Foundation of Which We Must Build, end quote. In the essay, Stewart advanced a multifaceted argument that addressed racism, nationalism, Christianity, individual responsibility, and communal possibility. Stewart expressed complex but discernible convictions that defy easy categorization. She celebrated the principles of American democracy and admired the United States as a nation that provided economic opportunities from people from the lower classes of society to improve their stations in life and attain higher levels of flourishing. But she also criticized white Americans for their woeful neglect of their black neighbors. Stewart noted, quote, but how very few are there among them that bestow one thought upon the benighted sons and daughters of Africa, who have enriched the soils of America with their tears and blood, few to promote their cause, none to encourage their talents. Enslaved Africans were unjustly transported to North America, and they and their descendants had certainly contributed to the making of the United States. Some fought for the Patriots in the American Revolutionary War, and others to protect the new republic in the War of 1812. Yet, white Americans continued to enslave black persons in the southern states, and free black Americans everywhere were denied the same rights and opportunities as the white population. There were, for example, few jobs for African Americans. The historians Stephen Kendrick and Paul Kendrick maintain that black Bostonians in the 1830s were, quote, in their words, almost completely blocked from professional roles in law and medicine. And they also faced structural obstacles to vocations as cabinet makers, carvers, caulkers, chandlers, mechanics, plumbers, polishers, roofers, upholsterers, and in other industrial labor. Black persons in Boston therefore worked as barbers, hairdressers, clothing retailers, clothing tailors, sailors, shipping agents, and in domestic labor, because these were the vocational employment opportunities available to them. Stewart surveilled the failures of black emancipation in the northern states, which included the racial oppressions that she had encountered throughout her life. And she charged, quote, "O America, America, foul and indelible is thy stain. Dark and dismal is the cloud that hangs over thee, for thy cruel wrongs and injuries to the fallen sons of Africa." 1 year later, Stewart wrote an article for The Liberator demonstrating her affection for the United States because it was founded on the pure principles, as she understood it, of justice and liberty for all. Quote, "O America, America, thou land of my birth, I love and admire thy virtues as much as I abhor and detest thy vices. And I am in hopes that thy stains will soon be wiped away and thy cruelties forgotten." Stewart weighed her abiding patriotism alongside her resolute Christian faith. In doing so, she identified the racial sins of her nation and demanded that its white citizenry actively work to remove the many stains of slavery. The prevailing message from Stewart was a resilient hope, both in God and nation, fueled by a righteous anger. When considering the past, present, and future of racism in American Christianity, I believe it is helpful to look closely at how Christians engaged American racism and the long shadow of slavery in the northern states. There were Christians in the United States who certainly shared Maria Stewart's commitment, but they comprised a small minority within American Christianity, and they encountered hostility from other Christians as they sought racial justice in the states that had abolished slavery, or in states such as Vermont where slavery never existed. The free black population in the United States rose from roughly 60,000 persons in 1790 to a little under 500,000 people in 1680. But even this larger number of free black Americans in 1860 comprised less than 2% of the overall U.S. population, roughly 31 million according to the 1860 U.S. Census. Christians pursuing racial justice appeal to the Bible in their pursuit of dignity, equality, and flourishing. There were several multiracial coalitions, and one shining example of multiracial mutuality is evident in the building of the first black church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But the rarity of such partnerships also illustrates the tenacity and ferocity of racism across towns, cities, neighborhoods, and churches throughout the United States. Stewart was frustrated that white women store owners in Boston generally did not employ black women. Some of these white women attended abolitionist meetings, raised funds for abolitionist causes, and declared that they would do whatever they could to help the poor and oppressed slave. But when Stewart asked them, "Here's one thing you can do, you can hire black women," they politely refused her request. Stewart summarized their responses in a speech. Quote, "Their reply has been, for their own part, they had no objection, but as it was not the custom, were they to take them into their employ, they would be in danger of losing the public patronage," end quote. The white woman insisted that they were not racist and pleaded for Stewart to understand their quandary. They worshiped a God who was no respecter of persons and believed that both racism and slavery were wrong. But they also felt that their personal reputations, and perhaps more importantly, their professional businesses, would sink if they hired a black employee. In 1813, James Forten was prompted to publish a pamphlet in response to deliberations on a bill in the Pennsylvania state legislature. Forten was not a writer, but he was a respected leader in the black community of Philadelphia. Born in a free black family in 1766, Forten learned how to make sails from his father and enlisted in the naval forces for the Patriots as a young teenager during the American Revolutionary War. British naval officers tried in vain to recruit Fortin. He declined their offer of a scholarship to study in England. Fortin was resolute in his devotion to the revolutionary cause and the nation that was forged in resistance to achieve democratic liberty. He was known for saying, "America, with thy faults, I love thee still." Fortin later owned a lucrative sail-making business and became one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia. He nonetheless encountered racism at every turn and witnessed how discriminatory forces and policies restricted black access to education and employment. Fortin's own children received private education from tutors because there was no adequate school for black pupils. Pennsylvania passed a gradual abolition law in 1780 that guaranteed emancipation to enslaved persons born after the act's passing when they turned 28 years of age. But emancipatory laws in the northern states did not produce racial equality. The results in cities such as Philadelphia was heightened animosity against black Americans from the broader white population. The proposed bill in the Pennsylvania legislature that drew Fortin's ire sought to severely restrict black movement within the state. An enraged Fortin sharply criticized the bill and highlighted the inhumanity of granting police officers the authority, quote, in Fortin's words, to apprehend any black, whether a vagrant or a man of reputable character, end quote, and demand to see a certificate confirming their legal status. Fortin protested two aspects of this predatory and prejudiced measure. On a legal basis, he questioned the fairness of imprisoning a free black resident without certificate for terms ranging from 6 months to 7 years, and even potentially for sale to an enslaver. Moreover, Fortin also challenged the bill on moral grounds because it illustrated a deep resentment of the black race and would further inflame further racial insult, as he envisioned white police officers and even white bystanders taunting black people in public with shouts of, in Fortin's words, "Aloha, stop the Negro," and "Oa, Negro, where is your certificate?" Fortin lamented that legislatures were debating a law that stood to him in clear contradistinction to the principles of civil liberty and simple human decency. Fortin appealed to sacred documents to undergird his protest. He connected the Declaration of Independence, Pennsylvania state constitution, and the Bible in his penetrating call for racial equality. All persons, he wrote, the Indian and the European, as well as the white man and the African, were created divinely by the Christian God and equally endowed with the same capacities. Fortin and all other black residents, certainly, Fortin argued, had certain inherent and indefeasible rights, and these rights included unconstrained access to travel throughout the state, no different than white people. Fortin asked, quote, "Has the God who has made the black man and the white left any record declaring us a different species? Are we not sustained by the same power, supported by the same food, hurt by the same wounds, pleased with the same delights, and propagated by the same means? We have the same bodies, we have the same hearts, we like the same food, maybe not all of it, we like some of the same food, we love the same. Everything is the same but the color of our skin." Fortin also offered an expansive interpretation of the founders and averred that their compromises on slavery at the Constitutional Convention presented black and white Pennsylvanians with an opportunity to demonstrate how a nation enacting Christian virtues and democratic principles could construct a racially just society after abolition. Fortin argued that the founders did not abolish slavery. They did not establish racial equality in the United States, but Fortin believed that they knowingly set a path for black liberations in their deflections and omissions. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention, according to Fortin, agreed that all men were created equal and did not particularize white and black. Whereas many white Americans in Fortin's day interpreted the Declaration of Independence as confined to white citizens, Fortin maintained the absence of explicit classification was an indication of a just future for black Americans after slavery. Fortin surmised they, the founders, knew that we, black Americans, were deeper skinned than they were. but they acknowledged us as men and found that many an honest heart beat beneath a dusky bosom. They felt that they had no more authority to enslave us than England had to tyrannize over them. Fortin was a fiercely patriotic military veteran and ardent Christian believer. He understood the difficulties of black flourishing after generations of enslavement and conceded that some free black persons had failed to rise above the arduous conditions. He, like other black abolitionists, did not stipulate that the black race was inherently exceptional or that every black person would thrive if given the opportunity. The black race, to Fortin and others, was equal to the white race and other races. Fortin did not suggest that the outcome of racial equality in the United States would be black perfection, but rather he anticipated that many black persons would become, in his words, useful members of society. And there would also be, in his words, a number of worthless men belonging to our color, as there were in white communities. So Fortin was saying, with equality, it's not going to be black perfection, but it is going to be similar to white people in terms of the math. Some of us will rise, will take that opportunity, and it will lead to flourishing, and we will be productive members of society. And he honestly admitted, others of us will not. But he said in the next breath, look at the white population. Isn't the same true of you? But he was not arguing for perfection and that everything would be great. But he said, we want the math to be similar. We want the same opportunities so that we can have the same results. Fortin held together in his heart and mind a confluence of despair and optimism, with the hopeful conviction that his city, his state, and ultimately his nation would embody the promises that he had fought for as a young man and continue to believe in with abiding faith. I find that quite moving, that he was known for saying, America, with thy faults, I love thee still. In the contemporary United States, the words Jim Crow are commonly affiliated with racial segregation in the southern region of our country. The foremost images that arise in most minds are of separate water fountains for white and colored people, with the former being of superior quality to the latter, and angry white mobs shouting at young black children trying to enter formerly all-white southern schools. We also remember the civil rights movement and think of moments from Alabama in the 1950s and 1960s, such as a 42-year-old black woman named Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery City bus in 1955, and the thousands of nonviolent demonstrators marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma 10 years later. We are slower to recall that racial segregation and Jim Crow laws originated in the northern states. The historian Steve Luxemburg observes how Jim Crow law certainly gained velocity in the South at the end of the 19th century, but began in the free and conflicted North shortly after the nation's founding. Meticulous and thorough regulations to mark and separate black people were unnecessary in the states that practiced slavery, as it was a coercive system with its own rules and regulations. But white Americans in the northern states instituted racial segregation in schools, restaurants, hotels, churches, neighborhoods, buses, and trains to control the presence of black persons. The city of Philadelphia was one of the most contested sites of racial segregation in the nation. For one reason, it was simply because the black population in Pennsylvania grew more than in any other northern state. In 1790, there were 10,274 black persons in the state, which was third most populous behind New York and New Jersey. By 1820, Pennsylvania's black population tripled and only trailed New York and greatly surpassed New Jersey. In 1840, Pennsylvania's black population was only slightly less than New York's and had more than doubled New Jersey. Because the center of black life in the state was found in Philadelphia, the city's population also rose from roughly 10,000 black people in 1810 to 15,000 in 1830. It was also where the specter of Jim Crow and racial prejudice loomed largest. The black population in Philadelphia resolved to achieve economic success and social recognition. These desires were not unusual in the antebellum northern states. Black women and men simply had the same strivings as white people. They too chased after the American dream and wanted to become, in the words of one historian, respected citizens with property and standing. but their efforts to attain well-paying jobs and purchase real estate were met with white resistance. At a psychic level, some white Philadelphians resented the changing attitudes and countenances of black people in their city. White people had grown accustomed to enslaved persons who rarely looked them in the eye, and were startled at the sight of newly liberated persons walking with more confidence in their steps and fortitude in their faces. The element that caused more contention than any other was in employment. White migration to Philadelphia also surged in the first half of the 19th century, as the city's overall population jumped from 100,000 people in 1816 to 164,000 people in 1830. The growing number of English, German, Irish, and other European immigrants arriving to the city collided with the existing labor force of white and black workers to create a fragile and volatile economic context, with increasing job competition and decreasing wages. As in Boston and other northern cities, the burgeoning industrial businesses in Philadelphia, ranging from textile mills to shoe manufacturers, restricted employment to white persons. In 1802, one abolitionist society seeking to address black unemployment reported that it could only find work for 20 of the 102 persons who had turned to it for assistance. Black Christians in Philadelphia therefore pursued the fullness of life and liberty with gratitude to God, appreciation for white allies, resilient determination, and righteous anger. The church was also a contested site of racism. In roughly 1792, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and several other black worshipers were accosted at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church because they refused to sit in a segregated section of a newly built gallery. These black worshipers had financially contributed during the church's stewardship campaign to renovate the sanctuary, and were surprised to learn that one outcome of their giving was an architectural redesign that further separated them from white worshipers. Allen explained that the racist incident occurred on the first Sunday worship after the renovation was complete. He remembered, quote, "We expected to take the seats over the ones we formerly occupied below, not knowing any better. We took those seats. We had not been long upon our knees in prayer before I heard considerable scuffling and low talking. While the black worshipers were knelt in prayer, a white church member seized Absalom Jones and admonished him, quote, 'You must get up. You must not kneel here,' end quote. Jones replied that he and the other black worshipers would get up and move after the prayer, but another white church member came over to assist the first white man in attempting to physically relocate the black worshipers to their designated pews in the gallery. Allen described the events that followed. By this time, prayer was over, and we all went out of the church as a body, and they were no more plagued with us in the church. This raised a great excitement and inquiry among the citizens, insomuch that I believe they were ashamed of their conduct," end quote. Allen and Jones were two of the 8 founding members of the Free African Society in 1787, and it was one of the first black-led organizations in the United States to provide social services such as medical care and job training to African Americans. The FAS also successfully advocated for a plot of land in the city's public cemetery, and ministers such as Allen and Jones officiated at weddings for black couples. Allen and Jones soon desired an autonomous black church distinct from white churches in Philadelphia. The two disagreed on the church's denomination. Allen wanted it to be Methodist from the onset, whereas Jones preferred that the FAS remain ecumenical in the fundraising stage so that we can get money from all the different churches and denominations, and later decide on a denomination closer to the church's opening. But both men believed in the importance of an independent black church in which black pastors and laity discern for themselves God's direction in congregational ministry. The racist confrontation at St. George's Church was therefore not the catalyst that inspired a new black church in Philadelphia, but the unfortunate episode fortified the conviction that black Christians would only find genuine spiritual flourishing in their own worship spaces. It is crucial here to emphasize the differences between racial separation and racial segregation. This vision for an autonomous church illustrates a self-motivated desire for racial separation in one aspect of black life. These black worshipers detested the imposition of racial segregation in formal laws and informal practices that denied them access to equal opportunities in education, employment, and human flourishing. But they also yearned to form their own racially distinct religious community, a black-led church that fostered authentic and creative expressions of African worship and spirituality, and a refuge that stood apart from the pervasive and soul-crushing racial prejudice that they encountered in their daily lives. Allen and Jones relied on white allies for support, and Allen publicly thanked the physician, Benjamin Rush, and the merchant, Robert Ralston, for their partnership. But the FAS received scant support from white churches. Clergy and laity from these churches opposed the creation of a separate black church. William White, rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia and bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church of Pennsylvania, angrily told Benjamin Rush that the proposed African church was ill-conceived because it was an exertion of black racial pride. Rush was dismayed at the apathy and hostility. Oh, let me move forward one more. Okay. Rush was dismayed at the apathy and hostility of white churches toward black Christians. He attended 2 different Presbyterian churches in Philadelphia during the 1770s and 1780s, and then he worshiped at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, which was likely where he was a congregation member when assisting the Free African Society. In 1792, Rush wrote to a friend in Boston, the white congregational pastor Jeremy Belknap, and expressed his hopes and grievances in the efforts to plant a new black church. Rush was encouraged that Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and other black leaders were making progress. But Rush complained that the white churches were not helping, and surmised that one reason was because these congregations did not want to lose their black worshipers. White Christians in the mainstream Protestant denominations sorely disappointed Benjamin Rush. They did not help their fellow black Christians, so Rush turned for financial aid to other white persons, such as John Nicholson, a brash business entrepreneur who did not rub shoulders among the city's coterie of elite white Christian patrons. One historian highlights how, quote, Nicholson provided what none of the established Philadelphia elite would offer, a large loan to begin construction of the church, end quote. Rush shared with Belknap his growing suspicion the only way to, quote, exercise the true spirit of the gospel nowadays was to flee from the mainstream Protestant churches because they seem more devoted to their forms or opinions than the doctrines and precepts of Jesus Christ, end quote. Rush and other abolitionists continue to encounter this improper weighing of Christian standards within white churches. Too many white Protestants in the mainstream denominations considered their theological disagreement on issues such as the proper mode of baptism as more determinative of Christian faithfulness than combating the sins of slavery and racial oppression. I think they chose to contend against one another on matters such as infant baptism and debate what biblical evidence supported sprinkling or immersing an adult believer rather than grappling with abolitionism. Rush knew that these white Protestants were betraying the true spirit of the gospel. Black and white abolitionists also understood that white Christians prefer discussing the intricacies of certain theological doctrines within the comfortable confines of ecclesial gatherings to reckoning with their most pressing societal injustices. In 1793, at the picture there, I think, Allen and Jones were both present on the inaugural day of construction for the first black church in Philadelphia. But Allen soon left the church after the organizing group selected its denominational affiliation. Allen and Jones both voted for Methodism, but the majority of the FAS leaders opted for the Episcopal Church. Jones consented and in 1794 became the pastor of the church, named St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church, later the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Richard Allen departed to form his own church, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, later named Mother Bethel AME, in the same year. Allen acknowledged that several of his FAS colleagues despised the Methodists after the cruel racism they endured at St. George's Church. But Allen resolutely believed that the Methodist connection, with its rich combination of in his words, rich doctrine and good discipline, were the most effective and faithful pathway for black Christian flourishing. Even the atrocious witness of some white Methodists did not shake Richard Allen's unwavering commitment to the Wesleyan tradition. As St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church was being built, its black and white organizers decided to host a dinner to celebrate the raising of the church's roof beams. Over 100 people gathered under the shade of large trees on the outskirts of the city. The group comprised bricklayers, carpenters, donors, and merchants. The white participants were served a bountiful meal by 50 or so future black congregants. After Benjamin Rush reluctantly agreed to take his reserved seat at the head of the table, he offered a toast to rousing cheers. When the white guests finished eating, they arose, and the black hosts took their seats. 6 of the white persons then served dinner to the black Philadelphians. Rush desired to be among the servers, but the black participants insisted that he and John Nicholson, the financier whose loan permitted the building of the church project, to stay in their seats. Benjamin Rush was moved when William Gray, a prominent black fruit vendor and FAS leader, was, in Rush's words, checked by a flood of tears, end quote, as William Gray attempted to deliver a toast. Several black church members approached John Nicholson at the end of the evening to express their heartfelt gratitude. Rush's wife, Julia Stockton Rush, was visiting her mother in New Jersey and not at the event. Rush therefore wrote about it to her from their Philadelphia home after he returned home. Quote, "Never did I witness such a scene of innocent, nay more, such virtuous and philanthropic joy. To me it will be a day to be remembered with pleasure as long as I live." In the letter's P.S., Rush added, quote, "Love as usual. Read this letter to your mama. She belongs to our African church." The dinner was indeed a rare occasion as black and white Philadelphians celebrated together with attentive kindness and mutual respect. But it was not an event in which racial realities were ignored or forgotten. The purpose of the multiracial gathering was to praise the progress in building the city's first black church. The white guests who served their black hosts directly addressed the racism that marked all their lives and determined to act in accordance to Christian principles. Benjamin Rush's memory of the event is bittersweet. His letter to his wife, I think, is the only written account of the event that historians rely upon. At one level, it is a powerful testimony of what is possible when American Christians across different races resolve to work together and fellowship at the same table. At another level, it is a sad indictment of how seldom this happened in Philadelphia and other antebellum northern cities. Racial animosity, rather than racial reciprocity, was the overwhelming current that charged the early American Republic in the states that had gradually abolished slavery. But the emergence of black vibrancy in the city was met with ferocious opposition from the broader white population. White mob violence erupted against black citizens on several occasions, especially at public festivals and black celebrations. In 1805, a violent group of white people attacked the many black persons who were also present to celebrate the 4th of July in city streets adjacent to Independence Hall. The white assailants resented how the growing black population had, in their racist minds, the audacity to participate alongside them in civic festivities. The 4th of July celebration in the shadow of Independence Hall became an exclusively white gathering over subsequent years. Some white residents even railed against black Philadelphians when they created their own galas. In 1828, a band of white hecklers taunted and assaulted black persons in front of an assembly hall where a black subscription ball was being held. They tore the gowns of some black women and struck other guests immediately after they arrived in their coaches. These white persons belonged to the working class, and they resented the display of black wealth in the forms of black couples publicly appearing in elegant dress and elaborate hairstyles, where white coach drivers and attendants assisted them. Middle and upper-class white Philadelphians also mocked their black counterparts. Some interpreted the economic struggles of the free black persons in the working class as evidence of black racial inferiority. But they also assessed black expressions of rising social stature as garish and unseemly. Several white artists in Philadelphia created satirical cartoons to poke fun and mock black residents. Edward Williams Clay published a series of 14 colored prints in the late 1820s entitled Life in Philadelphia. that depicted dark-skinned black Philadelphians in ostentatious fancy garb, trying to, according to Clay's images, mimic white gentility. These responses altogether illustrate the range and the rage of white resistance to black flourishing. The historian Gary B. Nash rightly identifies the history of Philadelphia in the decades after the Gradual Abolition Act as both a tragedy and a triumph. The development of black churches such as Bethel, which grew from a little over 200 members in 1799 to nearly 1,300 in 1813, is an example of the triumph. But Nash also finds, quote, "The tragedy lay in the unfulfilled promise of a racially equal and harmonious society. As devoted as some white Philadelphians were to the cause of anti-slavery and racial justice, they proved impotent to control their society at large. White Christians such as Benjamin Rush worked alongside black religious leaders to reform their city, but this multiracial coalition was simply outnumbered. Antebellum black abolitionists criticized slavery and racial oppression, but they did not seek to dismantle the structures of American capitalism and democracy. Patrick Rael, in his History of Black Abolitionism, astutely observes that black reformers in the antebellum northern states, they championed the middle-class values of in his words, quote, uplift, respectability, civilization, natural rights philosophy, republicanism, and liberalism, end quote, as their own political convictions, their own religious prescriptions, and their own social aspirations. Maria Stewart, James Forten, and other black abolitionists, they decried how systemic racism prevented black people from achieving the American dream, but they believed in this dream as much as, if not more than, white reformers. Rael accentuates that these black leaders, quote, did no violence to their own cultural heritage, end quote, in their yearnings for inclusion in the American middle class because they had helped build those values, just as black labor had helped to build northern cities. Later generations of black and indigenous activists, as well as white, Asian American, Hispanic American persons and individuals from other racial and ethnic communities would later challenge the capitalist structure undergirding the United States and call for large-scale government action and intervention in addressing inequities of race and class. But I believe it is imprecise to count antebellum black Christian reformers as among the ranks of this progressive undertaking. Perhaps some of their incisive observations and principled arguments about racism and racial equality lay the groundwork for future progressive movements. But these black abolitionists endorsed existing American structures and mainly wanted access to them. They did not criticize the American dream. They believed in the American dream and wanted more and eventually all black people to have access to this dream. Many black abolitionists drew inspiration from Christianity in their fight for racial justice. In 1846, the African Methodist Episcopal Church pastor and journalist Molliston Madison Clark asserted that, quote, the churches in America ought to use the whole weight of their influence against the practice of slaveholding, end quote. Clark believed that the Bible clearly condemned American slavery and that American churches had an obvious mandate to work for its eradication. Perhaps, Clark would say, American Christians had an unprecedented mandate to work for the eradication of black slavery. In doing so, and I find this really quite both winsome and sharp and moving from Clark, he wrote, quote, in doing so, the church would be doing nothing more than acting out her legitimate functions, end quote. In this historian's words, Clark did not ask American churches to be exceptional, just faithful, right? We're not asking you churches to be courageous, heroic, exceptional, sacrificial. What we are asking, can you be faithful? Can you be faithful to the gospel? Can you see what is going on when you leave your churches in the city streets and the nation and the world out there? Can you see the social, racial oppressions against people who look like me? And can you do something about it? Because that is what Jesus Christ wants us to do. The black Presbyterian minister, James W.C. Pennington, once a fugitive slave from eastern Maryland who had escaped slavery up to the north and became a congregational and then Presbyterian minister. He contended in 1849 that the gospel of Jesus Christ simultaneously encouraged nationalism and curbed its attendant biases and excesses. Quote, "It is a blessing to have a country, and it is a virtue to love it. But this love of country is capable of great abuse," end quote. Christians honored God through service to their fellow citizens, but their faith also anchored them in the immutable justice of God, that's Pennington's words, and constantly reminded them that persons of every nationality shared one common humanity. Pennington's vision of American Christianity readily acknowledged the paradox that patriotism was both a vice and a virtue to the Christian faith. American abolitionism was largely a Christian movement that held devotion to God and fidelity to nation together in productive tension. Not every abolitionist was a Christian, but many believed that their righteous struggle to form a racially just society was both possible, as well as the truest enactment of democracy and Christianity in the country they loved. America with thy faults, these black abolitionists loved it still. So that's the end of the lecture part. I'm glad to do Q&A and talking about the past, present, and future of American Christianity. But thank you for listening, and I hope something was useful in what I presented.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. We're so delighted to have you here. So here's our chance to engage with this conversation. It was a lot of great information coming at us. And if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will try and get to you. Will you? Oh, good.
As a native of Philadelphia, I'd like to, is Philadelphia the only example of poor behavior?
Oh, okay. Real quick. No, I think I lift it up because it is I think a clear and compelling example of the racial tensions that existed in the antebellum northern context after slavery was abolished, and one that would certainly, not in the same way, but in similar ways, happen and occur over and over and over again in northern cities and southern everywhere. So I think one of my points and what helped me, and when we think about the present and future of racism in American Christianity, we do tend to look at the civil rights movement, as we should. And we do look at particularly the challenges in the southern states, because if there were 500,000 roughly free black Americans in the northern states, there were roughly 4 million enslaved people in the southern states. And before the Great Migration from roughly 1915 to 1950, where millions of black Americans migrated north, it really was in the South where there were more black people and hence more black tension. But I note this to point out that it is to see the present and future, for example, of anti-black racism and other forms of racism. We can look as early as 1813. We can look as early as the 1810s for examples of how a predominantly white society was adjusting to new racial conditions and a new societal context with the gradual emancipation of black people. And we can see that there was a great contest. There were some white Christians who said, yes, this is new, yes, this is different, yes, this is hard, but we need to do what is right and just. So I find Benjamin Rush's letter, I'm not the only historian who's found this letter and wrote about it. It is really quite a poignant and powerful moment when the white guests eat all their food and then they get up and they serve the black guests their food. Rush is noting this is uncommon. This is something that we don't really see a lot of in 1793. But for him, it was a future of what was possible. If white Christians could not necessarily escape their context and escape the racism that pervaded in their society, but rather address it directly. At one level, transcendent, the justice and the love of God. It exceeds and it transcends our context, and it helps us see that which we don't think is possible. But at another level, it empowers us to do what is possible in moments such as that. I don't think the black and white people who were eating together then were trying to escape racism. Maybe they were in that moment within the larger city, but they really were addressing the racism that marked all their lives together. At least in this moment, at least in this table, at least as we eat together, we are going to serve you, our black hosts. So in that, I point out, just Philadelphia is a good example. As abolition movement, as racial justice movements were growing, of course, certainly you had the backlash. And Philadelphia, to me, provides one example of how that all transpired, and that episode, again, not directly repeated, but continued happening elsewhere. So to me, there's hope. It is a triumph, but it is a tragedy too. And I think we don't get to the hope without understanding the tragedy. But yeah, thanks for your question about Philly.
Other questions? You're a quiet group.
I'm thinking about when the Civil Rights Act was passed and the terrible things that happened with schools trying to be segregated in the South. How did churches participate in that? Were churches encouraging segregation, encouraging integration? How did churches respond to that civil rights movement in the South, particularly?
Oh, sure, thanks. And so I find helpful, even before thinking about even in the lead up to the 1952 Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas Supreme Court decision, which said in public schools segregation is no longer legal. So it's certainly one challenge within American Christianity in the battle or the fight against racism is to note that one of it's kind of a paradox. It might be vice and virtue, similar to Pennington on American patriotism. One of the best things about American Christianity is that it is a voluntary religious organization. It is an organization where no one has to be in a church. It is not a state-sponsored religion. There is no direct government financial assistance that helps churches. Now, some say there are some laws in place that help in other ways, but it is not. And this was a radical departure from Western Europe. This was something in this time period that I highlight in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s. This was something that European commentators, including Alexis de Tocqueville, Harriet Martineau, recognized as the first woman sociologist, visited here from England in the 1830s. They noted that this is amazing. It was amazing to them with their French and English eyes to imagine that churches could not only survive, but thrive without taxpayer money, without direct government support. You mean people, these churches, these big, beautiful churches with these great ministers, mostly men in that time, that this is all happening, like through voluntary contributions, through tithes and offerings? It really was like shocking to them that this was working. So that's the best. But the worst part of it that both Martineau and de Tocqueville and others recognized is that it did leave churches vulnerable to popular opinion. I like what Harriet Martineau said. She said the clergy are generally, and she said different from England. She said, I don't know that one is better than the other. They tended to call the American thing, what was happening here, the voluntary principle or voluntarism versus the Church of England there. She said both have good and bad things. In England, I guess good thing is we're not always needing people to give money to this and that. Bad thing is that churches are political organizations, and some of our ministers are really chasing better appointments and chasing nicer parsonages and public esteem and all of that. But she said in the United States, it's nice that the clergy are generally not seeking a lot of wealth. They're not money-grubbing, money-seeking people, the clergy. But they're also paid, and this is the phrase that really caught me, because their pay consists of small salaries and large presents. Isn't that a good way of saying that? Small salaries and large gifts. They are vulnerable to not preaching the whole truth. It is hard for them to convey truth that disrupts and challenges dominant cultural norms that many of the people who come to the churches hold. So now to fast forward to the 1950s, one of those dominant cultural norms was segregation. That in some ways, I agree with the black theologian James Cone, who I wrote about in the intro for this lecture. And he writes in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, I think it came out 2011, he says, white Southerners lost the Civil War, but they did not lose the cultural war. That's literally his words. The war of white supremacy, the war in which the white population dominated the black population through violence and coercion, but also through theology, through teaching and inculcating white Christians for decades and decades after the Civil War, that segregation is God ordained, that we are destined by God to live apart from one another, that the white race and the black race should not intermingle, that there should not be, they use this word, social equality, in part because they recognized after the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, that there was political or civil equality, but they continued to argue from the 1870s on that civil equality, political equality, even racial equality in the form of that God loves all of us does not mean social equality. It does not mean that our children go to the same schools and that we live in the same neighborhoods, because God wants us to be separate from one another. And so that was happening for roughly 100 years, a little less than, when schools were desegregated by the U.S. Supreme Court. So many white Southerners and white Northerners as well took it very hard and did not want to integrate. And I think we all know, I don't want to get too much into the history, that yes, the Supreme Court mandated it, but they said it needs to happen in due time. So it was only 3 years later. It took 3 years in Arkansas for the Little Rock Nine, for those brave 9 teenagers to go to school at the previously all-white Central High School. In a state like South Carolina, public schools didn't begin integrating until 1963, 9 years after Brown v. Board. So all of that was happening. And yes, so some preachers knew it was wrong and wanted to support it, and some did. Others did not, for a multitude of reasons. One is because their churches is a voluntary group, and they knew that. So I don't want to all say like they were scared for their jobs and they just, they wanted to keep preaching in their pulpit. Some of that is true. But really what they understood is that this is not an effective word for my congregation. They will not hear me. They will not listen to me. It will repel, and we will get nowhere. And for others, quite frankly, it was. For some of them, it was their livelihoods. So all of that happened. So yes, churches, I think individual white Christians did really ally with and partner with and do good work in the civil rights movement. I think somewhat different in terms of the quantity, more than in the period of slavery, but the same problem continued to exist. Individual white Christian leaders could mobilize and work with black leaders outside of the church, but it was very hard to do work in the church. Churches themselves, as institutions and denominations, were very reluctant to participate both in the abolition movement and a century later in the civil rights movement. So a lot of them did really wrestle with. So the last thing I'll say about this long-winded answer, Marianne, is that this also best and worst of American Christianity. Like, for people who say churches can't do great things, really, and churches aren't political organizations. Churches aren't civil organizations. We don't have the budgets and the taxpayer money that our local governments or federal government does. I would say one challenge to that is white churches in the South who did not want their white children to go to school with black children did do great things. They built great private schools. Schools that at first they wondered, could they be as good as the public school? Do we have the resources? Again, we don't have taxpayer money to do it. Eventually, they built schools that were better in resources. People of faith who did not know that much about how to build a school. All they knew, and it was a lot of white women, mothers of white kids and teenagers who just knew. And some of them had to cajole their husbands and the fathers to get on board. We've got to build these schools. We need great schools for our kids, because now Brown v. Board is happening, and we don't want our kids to go to school with black students. And they did great things. Again, terrible reason, right? Hard truth. But they did great things. And this is to say, because as a voluntary organization, churches were some groups of people, critical mass of people who really want to do something, who really want to change something, who really want to do amazing things. It is totally possible. When people are inspired, for these in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was love for white children. It was terrible, misguided, immoral love in some way, but what that love generated was, we can do amazing political, civic, educational things. So if that can happen then, certainly that can happen today. Churches where Christians, people of faith, don't have to be here but want to be here, can do great things, can raise great amount of money and do amazing things for their community and their families and their nation. It is totally possible.
Other questions?
Yeah, in your book, you spend a fair amount of time talking about your current employer and their history. I wonder how your book was taken by the people at where you work, and how is the history of where you work handled?
Oh, yeah, thanks. So I teach at Columbia Theological Seminary, founded in 1828, a school that was in Columbia, South Carolina till roughly the 1920s, and then moved to Decatur, Georgia, largely for economic reasons, seeing kind of land and opportunity in a growing city of Atlanta. So yeah, it is an institution that was deeply active in pro-slavery Christianity. So real quick, the thing to note, and I don't get it here, but in terms of the backlash, so I think when a lot of people, when they think about, for example, history of Christianity and slavery and racism, what happens is they think, oh, people back then, they were, I think they were more comfortable calling our ancestors ignorant rather than immoral. What I mean by that is to say they didn't know better. Oh, they couldn't read the Bible like we do. They didn't have all of these, what we call in seminary land, hermeneutical methods of inquiry and interpretation. All of that stuff came out of Germany in like the 1870s, 1880s, and then to the United States in the 1890s. Oh, if they had those tools, they would have, things would have been better. They were just ignorant. And in some ways, that is easier to accept than immorality. Then they were deeply immoral people who were conflicted and who knew better but chose not to do better. I think one example of that is, so we think the pro-slavery movement was really strong at first in the 1620 and the like. It was really strong. They believed it was right, and it chipped away over time. And over time, as people started knowing better, people were like, oh yeah, maybe this is wrong. Oh yeah, maybe this isn't God's way, and the like. And then finally, by 1860, the dam had broken enough that, eventually it was emancipation. But in truth, it's actually the opposite. It's totally opposite. When you look, 1700s, the first pro-slavery Christian treatise didn't get published until 1701, when a Massachusetts merchant published a response to an abolitionist tract that came out in 1700 in Boston. And then, so from 1701, really, until then, there were still wonderings, but as more the abolition movement grew, so too did pro-slavery. It was directly connected. The most pro-slavery Christian, like theology, tracts, things published, sermons, were all after 1830. Until 1830, it was more quietly kind of defended. Preachers actually in the southern states didn't preach that much about defending slavery as an institution. Now, they still gave those awful sermons from those few verses in like Ephesians 6 and the like, slaves obey your masters and all of that stuff. And two, they loved the, wives obey your husbands stuff. They did preach that stuff. But, and so one of their arguments was, look, God gave us, it's a three-legged stool. The scripture clearly teaches. Wives obey your husbands, children obey your parents, slaves obey your masters. Like, you can't have one and not the other two. You got to believe all three. So sometimes, some marriages aren't that good, but that doesn't mean we throw away the institution of marriage as not, divinely ordained. Some parents exacerbate and abuse their children. That doesn't mean parenthood is not of God. So yes, there are some problematic instances with slavery, and we need to condemn them and reform them, wicked enslavers. But that doesn't mean we throw out the whole system. So all of that, so there's a little bit of that, but even there, like what I've shared now, all of those arguments and that kind of preaching doesn't really happen until after 1830. And it's really only because the abolition movement gained some momentum, and it gained some progress, and it gained some followers. As more and more Americans in the northern states and a few in the southern states are reading the Liberator newspaper and hearing and really confronting what the sin of slavery really is. And so that's where the pro-slavery movement really grows, because they need. Because these abolitionists, they keep appealing to the Bible, and they're saying Jesus wants us to do this. So they need arguments, too, that says, no, that's wrong. Jesus actually says we should do this, and the like. And so my seminary where I taught was deeply influential in a lot of that pro-slavery biblical interpretations. Professors, donors, owned enslaved people. The seminary has money in our endowment that comes from bequeathments, a quite legal, ordinary thing that happens even in 2024. When a stewardship committee, or for us, when our philanthropy department, when they raise money, one of the ways they do it is they look for wills and bequeathments. When you die, would you consider leaving Columbia Seminary in your will? And people in the 1840s did that. And what they did is they said, we'll leave you some of our property. So we'll leave you animals, land, and we'll also leave you our enslaved people. Or we will have auctions. We will auction off this land, this property, these enslaved people, and the funds from that can go to Columbia Theological Seminary. So yes, all of that was happening. And so, long story short, it is, I think the book was finally received at my school in 2022. I think perhaps the one part that I don't think I have consensus. I think I have a little bit of support here and there, but not a lot. I did, after publishing it, I mean, I knew beforehand too, I did say, so in addition to thinking about Black racial repair and doing that work, some of it in scholarships, endowed chairs, new professors, and the like, we really should, I don't know what the dollar amount is or anything like that, but enslaved people were sold, and that money is in our endowment. So we should make every faithful effort to find the descendants of those enslaved people and figure out a mathematical formula, confessing and noting. It's not like, here's this dollar amount, that's what we think is right. But this is what we can do, and this is what we will provide as an apology to you, to note our connections, not only to the pro-slavery movement out there, but to your family, to generations of your family. That's been a challenge. I think it's because that type of reparations is also challenging more broadly in the United States. I think in this case, and me too, I still have my own questions about what a federal government can do about historic sins versus what institutions like mine can do. I don't think it's the same script. I don't think it's the same prescription. So I don't know. I'm still thinking through what governments can do. But I think it's clear to me that this is what my institution can do. And I told my institution, Virginia Theological Seminary, an Episcopal school, they did just this. They dedicated roughly $2 million out of their $200 million endowment. So it's 1%, and they noted it's not enough. And they made every effort with a genealogist to find the descendants of enslaved people and people who labored at the school under Jim Crow segregation for less wages to offer them financial payments. And the New York Times wrote about it. And what I like this one man they interviewed, he said, I'm grateful for the money, but this doesn't make up for what my father or grandfather endured in the 1930s at Virginia Seminary. But Virginia Seminary was fine. I think the point of what they did is it's not for applause. It's not to say, we're doing this great thing. They didn't. They did it quite matter-of-factly in my mind. They said, this is something wrong. This is a past sin that comes from past money, and we still benefit from this money today. So here is a small portion of that money as an act of confession and recognition. So yeah, my hope is that Columbia Seminary would do that. But again, I'll share with you honestly, sometimes it feels a little bit like a voice in the wilderness. But yeah, I'm not going to lose hope.
It's on. For your work and the lecture today, and I'm continuously have the question of how does this change? You talk about the historical piece and the reactions and what happened, and even some means of healing. But we see this continue to, in fits and starts, and continue to build on itself. For instance, you talk about the problems and the historians, people that you note, and what they did about it, and how, you know, the church, and started a new church even, having to separate from a white church and start a black churches even. So, you know, the constant question is, how do we right ourselves, understand the wrong, and move forward? You know, because what we continue to see, and what black people especially continue to experience, is that retrogression. You know, a moment start, and it's like, yeah, we're going to recognize the inequities that we see in our society, in our community. And, you know, it doesn't take much to have all of a sudden all those advances taken away and stepped on and move along. And because that can happen in a society where, you know, African Americans are like 14% of the population, so you can have the majority of society say, oh, we don't care. You know, big deal, we're gonna move on, and we will move on in even more aggressive forms. And so I wonder what your thoughts might be in terms of how do we make steps and make those steps permanent and make those steps work.
Okay, thank you. That is a question, if not the question. So I think a few things. I think one needs to have a sufficient understanding of history so that one can see the legacies and kind of trace through a through line of how we got here. But what I will also say is that one need not be a professional historian to be on the side of racial justice and do work that really matters and that really makes a difference. I do think that is one, I don't want to say mistake, but that is one pitfall that I see in some, for example, predominantly white churches. It is the idea, how much do I need to study? How many books do I need to read in my anti-racism book group and reading group before I have a plan to do something that will make a difference in my community and in my country? And so I do. Sometimes I'm a little bit like, I'm grateful when my book is read, I'm invited, and Zoom has made it more possible. But sometimes I do ask the groups, like, you know, this is the 18th, mine is the 18th book you've read. What have you done? Or what are you thinking about doing? But my point of that is not to say you should keep reading. Reading is important. Illumination and education is important. But it continually needs to be tied with discernment about what I can do. What I can do in my community, what I can do, what are things that I can do to combat racism and enact racial justice. Some say, I'm in a real predominantly, you know, white neighborhood, not a lot of people of color where I am. So what I would say is, sometimes it is different. And part of what's hard is that it is challenging. It takes attacking it, if you will, on multiple fronts. So at one level, it is supporting people of color, particularly marginalized people of color, such as black people, in different industries and businesses and in worlds, who are in middle management, but having a hard time to get to upper management. It is figuring out what's going on there in a school to promotion. How do I support? How do I encourage? What do I do about that? That's my business. That's my school. That's where I work. But noting that is different from some of the challenges with racial inequities and poverty. That is another challenge. So it is not to equate. It is insulting to say that every person of color needs my work with anti-poverty. Not all do. But racial disparities in this country and realities do say that there are both people of color and white people who are on the margins because of poverty and because of great wealth inequality. So the challenge for all of us is to figure out, what am I going to do about this? Certainly at one level is, what am I going to do it as a voting person of faith? Christians are voting people of faith. How are we going to get educated? What are we going to do there? Every 2 years, every 4 years. And then it is to ask, what am I going to do? What am I going to do in my family? What am I going to do in my church? And it is also to recognize that Thanksgiving dinner and arguing with a few family members, that I can devote 10% of my energy to that because I want to stand up and I want to do what's right at the big Thanksgiving table. But to note that that's actually not the most efficient, effective use of my time. Likely, I'm not going to persuade that uncle or that grandmother, or that niece or that nephew. I'm not going to persuade them. I'm going to stand up, I'm going to speak the truth and say what's right. But ultimately, for all of us, it is to invest our energies in partnering with and figuring out what are things we can do. Partnering with churches and organizations that are, for example, African American or other congregations and organizations of color. And befriending and getting to know and seeing the work they're doing and figuring out how to support it. Sometimes it is supporting it with simply a financial donation. They are doing work that I cannot do. They are doing work that I am not doing and that I am not equipped and I am not prepared to do. So what I can do is, I have a job, I draw an income, so I can give them money. I get it, for all of us, we don't want to just write a check. But sometimes I want to ask some people, are you writing any checks? Am I writing any checks? There are some cases where that is actually something good we can do. It is finding organizations and churches we trust. And at one level, it is worshiping together. That should happen. But at another level, it is supporting good work that is already happening. And it is through relationships, seeing, is this an organization that aligns with my values? This is something I believe in. And sometimes what's going to happen now is that some organizations and some people of color groups or groups for racial justice, some will align with you more than others. Some align with me more than others. And one challenging thing is to navigate. But this has always been true. It is hard. This black leader tells me to do that, but that black leader tells me to do that. In fact, it is because these two black leaders disagree with one another. They have the same goal for racial justice. W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington disagreed with one another vehemently about how to combat Jim Crow segregation. Du Bois said, we need more black youth in the liberal arts education. Booker T. Washington said, why? There are not going to be that many jobs for them afterwards. So I support industrial labor. If you're a sharecropper, be the best sharecropper you can be so that ultimately you can earn enough money to buy a little land and grow your own crops and do your own business. These are the skills that black people need. Whereas Du Bois says, certainly some black people need that, but a talented tenth of us, at least 10% of us, need a liberal arts education. And they vehemently disagreed with one another throughout their careers. The Black Panthers and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement disagreed with one another on what we should do. So ultimately, it is for those of us who are non-black Christians, for example, I don't want to equate all racism to anti-black racism, but as an example, it is for us to figure out which leaders do we want to support and ally with and join together. So it's okay that we don't agree with all of them. Some, for example, are very critical of American capitalism. Others are less critical of American capitalism. It is how you understand capitalism and how you understand equal opportunity and figuring out how to do that. The big thing, though, ultimately is that it is like while we're figuring this all out, doing work. It is doing work incrementally and continually. It is not saying, I'm going to do all this research for 10 years and then I'm going to do this one thing. It is while I'm doing this research and while I'm learning, here are the things that I'm going to do. And sometimes it is learning through mistakes. I wish I didn't give that group $300. I actually don't really love what they're doing. That's okay. There's another $300 to give in the next cycle. I'm going to be okay with that, or in things like that. But it is sometimes we get so discouraged that we don't do anything, or we feel like we need all of this information. The last thing I'll say to this question is I'm really inspired by the NACW, National Association of Colored Women, started roughly turn of the 20th century before the NAACP. And because of sexism, got kind of a little bit marginalized by the NAACP and sexist black men. But nonetheless, the NACW, Mary Church Terrell, is one of the leaders in DC. Their motto was lifting as we climb. It's beautiful, right? We got a mountain to climb because black women are really oppressed and we're down here. But while we climb this mountain, we're going to lift others up. We're going to lift while we climb. Same thing for us, for those of us who need healing from racial trauma, and particularly for some of us, not particularly, but for some of us who are white and really wrestling with. I meet many white Christians who say either they grew up in the South or they go to Montgomery, they go to the museum, they go to the Civil Rights Museum, and it is a horrible history. to see angry white mobs, or even just to see normal white people just hands in their pocket watching a black person being lynched in their town and community. Yes, this is all horrible. We all need a lot of healing from this. But it is also, we need to, working while we heal, working while we get educated, working while we mobilize. What are the things that we can do? Because we want a better future now. How can we support movements that are fighting against racial injustice? And how do I get involved in that? Sometimes it is a neighbor. Sometimes it is to say, I see what's going on in this neighborhood. I see a person of color being assailed and being attacked or being ridiculed or getting a hard time because, in that moment, what can I do? What can I do with any kind of privilege or power I have to step in and do something about that? How can I support people of color where I work? How can I support people of color in my church or wherever? There are things that we can do every day, and we need to do these things while working for the bigger things. So that's my long-winded answer. I hope that is somewhat helpful.
Hi, I'm a Michigan girl from most of my life, but in the late 1990s, we lived for 2 years in Sumter, South Carolina. During the time we were there, a couple of black pastors and a couple of white or Caucasian pastors got together and formed an organization named BUILD. And what they did was suggested people from their congregations get involved. We filled out surveys about our interests and what our backgrounds were, and they matched us. In the group I was in, there were 6 African Americans and 6 whites. We were charged to have a meal together once at this big general meeting, and then get together once or twice during the school year, and at the end of the year there'd be another big joint meeting. Well, our group decided we would meet every month. And this organization was still growing strong the last time I was in South Carolina, but that's been about 20 years now. So I assume, and Sumter was a very small town, a very bitterly divided town, but we saw movement forward from community. The name of the group was called Community, and unity was in different colored letters on our shirts. So we really tried to work together. So then we moved to Lexington, Kentucky, in 1998, and about 4 years later, Pastor Joe from the African Methodist Church and Pastor from my own church, whose name escapes me right now, from the Presbyterian Church, Second Presbyterian Church of Lexington, decided to get together and learn about an organization that was working with churches to build connections. And they started an organization called BUILD in Lexington community, the whole area. Almost every congregation in town joined, African American congregations and Caucasian congregations. And we met to discuss issues in small groups. And every year, the groups would vote on 2 or 3 issues to work on together. And we built community over the years, and it was still going strong today. It started in probably 2002, and it is still going strong today. People get along, people enjoy each other, they come to worship with each other, we visit each other's churches, and work on issues together. And the working on issues has been very instructive because we realize that it takes all of us to solve a problem, like how children are discriminated against in school, how they're affected, how high school students are affected in the way they're treated based on the color of their skin. But by all working together, and then we would call in the appropriate leaders from the community, for example, the mayor or the school board superintendent or the superintendent of schools, and we would give them what we thought, after a whole year of research, what we thought a solution possible to the problem was, and then we'd ask them to implement it. And we would let them discuss why they would or wouldn't, but if they said they wouldn't, we took the microphone away. And eventually it built a huge community of people who got together for all kinds of activities. And Lexington's a southern city, but it is not a divided city anymore. I meant to end by asking if you know if this type of affiliation is happening in other countries, in other states.
It is happening. I don't want to overstate it in everywhere, but these are good. These are good examples of interracial or multiracial coalitions who have agreed to and committed to gather with one another for fellowship, but also for advocacy. Where do we have maybe not unanimity, but where is there consensus? What are some issues that we can publicly advocate for together? And I think that is a wonderful example of like being together to work together. And one last thing I'll say about that is certainly what happens in some of these multiracial coalitions are working through some disagreements and coming to consensus that is not like we're all in on this. But for example, one thing to note, there is ongoing discussion today about immigration and what we can do. How do we secure our border for some of us, people of faith, without vilifying immigrants and still protecting asylum-seeking refugees? But it is to note that Christians can have different perspectives on the political issue of immigration. For example, I know for really quite awful reasons, Springfield, Ohio was in the national news after the Trump-Harris first debate and the like. And that's the status from the Biden-Harris administration, TPS, temporary protected status for Haitian immigrants. So it is, I think, possible for Christians to disagree, to say, some can say, I want TPS to continue. I think it is a good program that brings migrants, particularly from instability and violence in their home countries, to our country as a host country, and it is economically helpful for us as a country, while recognizing some of the challenges with large-scale immigration in small cities and the stress that causes to the culture and the civic services of such a city like Springfield. It's possible for some Christians to say, I support that. It is also possible for some Christians to say, I don't support that. I think we should revoke TPS. I think ultimately it does more harm than good in American communities. I think there can be lively debate. And I think what I hope in that, though, would be, but we are not going to vilify and hate the immigrants who are here under TPS. It is one thing to disagree about the policy. One can disagree with the policy while being supportive of and respecting human dignity and human decency, and especially fighting against the stokes of anti-Haitian racial violence and language. It's possible to do both. So that's what I would hope would sometimes come. I think in some of these multi-racial coalitions, you will have Christians of color who say, I do not support widespread, wide-scale immigration because of the stresses that it causes to communities of color who are already in this country. I think that is a viable political and moral position if coupled with, but we are not going to despise and discriminate and hate and ostracize and vilify those who are here under lawful policies, even from politicians who I did not vote for. They are human beings made in the image of God. So I'm going to love them, I'm going to be just to them, while at the same time supporting policies that will restrict future TPS and other type of immigrant policies from coming. I think that, and my hope to your point is that that's what would happen when people of faith gather together and talk together. To hear and say, you're not just this nativist, anti-immigrant, terrible person. I can see why you have some concerns about TPS and other type of policies like that. But can we agree on together? I think that's totally possible. And I hope that groups like Build and others in different cities like Lexington and the like, that is great work to do. And that is great work to do in my city and yours too.
What is TPS?
Temporary
Protected
status. It is how, what is it? How many? Over 10,000 Haitian immigrants under TPS. They came to different cities. And what happens with immigration is, in a certain city, some people find good jobs. And what do? They tell other people, come to this city. There are good jobs here in this city. And there are affordable places for us to live. And we're okay with 3 families living together in a single family home. And we'll do that for a season while we find another pathway to more. But certainly that challenges people who already live in a community, who don't want to live 3 families to a home and are seeing their rent go up because there are other people who are willing to pay less. And so it is to wrestle and grapple with all of that it is very hard. But anyways, that's the point. So I didn't like when people were saying, like, oh, people in Springfield, they're terrible. They don't want those Haitian immigrants there. A lot of people did. But I thought there's honest discussion. It is hard for a community culturally to have that many people. And I liked what the Republican governor, DeWine, said in Ohio. He wrote a nice op-ed. They're helping the Springfield, it's my city, my state. They're helping people. They're doing jobs that otherwise no one else was doing. They're building up our economy. They're paying taxes in a whole lot of ways. But the driving culture between Haiti and here are different. We do need to work with these immigrants to help them drive more safely on our streets. I think that's honest, and that's a good way, I think, to frame it. But anyways.
We don't have a lot of extra time. Thank you so much for your words. I, 3 years ago, joined the NAACP, and yesterday, the Lansing branch of the NAACP sponsored a blood drive at a church in the Lansing area, along with that church and another organization. And I was there just helping at the table, and there were 2 of us people who had white skin and 2 people had black skin. And sadly, one man just asked the question of why were we there? And he didn't realize, I think it was his congregation, he didn't realize that outside groups could be there, having a presence in the blood donation. So my friend, who was black, very kindly, I could see the underneath in her, but very kindly explained to him how we got there, why we were there, and this man was white. And he just said, okay, and left. And that precipitated an amazing conversation with the 4 of us. And my 2 friends shared their stories, accomplished, very highly educated women, black, just shared a few stories about the, horrors, pains that they experience just about every day. And then my other friend and I, who were white, they asked us, so how did you get involved with this? And so we shared our stories. So, it just pained me that here we're in a church and they didn't want us to be there. This man didn't want us to be there. But yet we were, and I don't know, I'm on the health committee, and we're people from the health committee. So I'm sure we're gonna have a discussion. Do we go back and have a presence there or not? But I am glad we were there. And so thank you for your words today. We've got some other people who want to ask questions.
Hi, I'm really glad you brought up the issue of xenophobia, because I think there's some really clear connections between xenophobia and racism within the Christian church specifically. And so you mentioned, Christians being able to have difference of opinion around certain kinds of migration policies, but should be able to agree, not to vilify migrants, right? But when you ask, so I do this work in survey data, when you ask questions like, is immigration generally a good thing or a bad thing? And questions like, would you want immigrants to settle into your community? I mean, things that are just kind of generally, do you think immigrants are good people who bring good things to where they come? The division is really very clear, that it's white people who are Christians that are the most xenophobic. Christians of color tend to be very open to migration. Black, Hispanic, and Asian Christians in particular, and even non-Christians. The problem is really foundational to this vilification, that people are defining, white Christians are defining migrants as something that's bad. And what's really fascinating and is sort of, I'm trying to get my head around, and I wonder if you have some thoughts about this, seeing, in the historical records, greater religiosity leads to more xenophobia among white Christians. So the more often you go to church, the more xenophobic you are, if you are a white Christian. And so something is happening in predominantly white Christian congregations that is problematic, to put it really mildly. And so I'm wondering if because in these historical records, I know it's like what you can get from people is a little bit different than what I can get about people, right? But I wonder if you are seeing something that maybe, and I found the comment about pastors in America having to kind of preach to the choir to make sure that the choir keeps coming back and giving tithes. If that's what's going on, but like something very toxic is happening in white Christian churches, and this recent election has literally set my brain on fire trying to figure this out. And I wonder, as an historian, if you have any insights on that.
I don't know about. What I will say is immigration has certainly always been a contested issue in the United States. And the United States has wrestled as a nation with positions on immigration that in some ways, I lean on some Christian theologians who study this. I do find quite, and I know we're over time, quite compelling is American immigration is different from other countries in that it is trying to both be like good for our economy, but also a moral statement about what the United States is as a nation of liberty, nation of immigrants, and the like. And that is different from other non-Western countries. I think this is also happening in some Western European countries too. So that is a real challenge to have these two, in some ways, not always contradictory, but sometimes contradictory impulses. We only want to support immigration that is in our national economic self-interest. Or we want to support immigration because we are a beacon of freedom and we recognize that there are people in other countries who can come here and they can have a better life, more life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that says something good about our nation morally, but also is economically good too, all of that. So I don't think white Christians and all Christians are immune to figuring out how to navigate this complexity and this challenge. So for me, it is to be honest and clear about what immigration policies do all of us want to support, how we see immigration working, and how we treat immigrants. And the one thing I'll say with xenophobia in churches, it is sometimes that churches should be a great place for these kind of hard conversations to happen. Because churches are a voluntary organization built on the bonds of trust. People of faith in a church don't always agree with one another, don't always agree with their pastor don't always agree with them. But ultimately, it is a group of people who have come together because they trust one another enough. Likely, it is because of a lot of accompaniment. It is people who disagree politically, disagree theologically, who have accompanied one another in hard times. I don't always love what she said on that Sunday, but she was with me in the hospital. She helped my family through this difficult time. So we're going to be in this together, and we're going to figure out together how we can combat racism and xenophobia while coming to an understanding of what are good political positions for you to have, for I to have, and where we can understand some of those complexities. So my hope is that more of that would happen in churches. But my fear is actually less of that is happening in churches. And part of it is for the reason I named, because there is a great fragility and a fear of disagreement that will take people away. And these disagreements about racial justice and political issues will divide a congregation. And there are several stories that I've read of congregations actually really dissolving and falling apart because they were trying to talk together about racial justice and, for example, what does it mean to be a faithful Christian in immigration? That does happen. So when I share these things, I say, this is what I want, and this is what I dream, and this is what I'm trying to do in my church and my seminary, and what I want you to do. I want to recognize that I think it is a good pathway and the best pathway, but I can't say it's without risk. If you do these things, if you talk about these things in your church, one outcome, not my preferred outcome and not the outcome I want for you and me, but one outcome is separation. One outcome is division. One outcome is there might be very little left in your church. It is partly because, in some ways, it is how strongly many Americans kind of view politics. It is for me to recognize, and this isn't in all cases, this isn't in all communities, but in some communities, I imagine like the community here, in this one, because it's kind of like my community, where it does matter a great deal. And so you kind of got to figure that out. You know, Ezra Klein, when he wrote Why We're Polarized, he noted in 1960, he found this other survey, like less than 10% of Americans would be angry if their kids married someone of a different political party. But he noted in 2010, so this is all pre-Trump, that the number had jumped to like 40%. That it was like 40% for Republicans, 30% for Democrats. I bet now in 2024 it would even be higher than that. Like, yes, you, my kid, you can marry someone of a different race, someone different of faith, different class, but what party do they belong to? Who did they vote for? Nope, they're out. So I get that that's a real thing that we have to wrestle with. I don't, and you can hear me, I do. It's hard. I actually don't think we should identify that strongly with political parties. They are parties, they're not perfect. I think we should identify strongly with politics and morality, but I'm wrestling with that could happen. But what I want is I want churches to figure that out. Figure out, what do we really think about this? Where do we agree? Where do we disagree? And how can we come to a consensus view that is moral and just? Not unanimous, but consensus. Where can we get to a view where 80% of our people want to do this great thing? What happens to the other 20% though? That is a challenge. They might leave. And I don't know, I don't want to say that that's not going to happen. But anyways, sorry, Dr. Monroe.
That's actually a good place for us to conclude. I've been getting the wave from Marianne Larzalier. I want to thank...
I would like to say one last thing. That tomorrow we have the opportunity to have lunch with Professor Yo, and I would invite you to come. It's here, and we have the opportunity to also learn information from a group, the Justice League of Greater Lansing, Michigan, who is offering a solution. So I'd like you to come, because this conversation today would be apropos for the conversation we could have tomorrow and what you could do. So I invite you. It's at 1 o'clock.
12 o'clock? Is it at 12?
1. It's at noon.
Is that noon?
12?
12 o'clock.
So again, thank you so much, William, for coming.
Thank you.